So this marks the beginning of the third month of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Of course, has been going on in a sense for 8 years, but the full-scale war, as in with attacks all along the border, it's no longer discrete, limited only to the illegal occupation of Crimea and attacks in Donbass and Luhansk. There was that attempt to seize the Ukrainian capital, but that ended in a dismal and costly failure for Russia. And it is true that the focus of Russia's so-called special military operation is Luhansk and Donbass. I mean, it's special in as much as the Russian military has demonstrated itself to be especially inept. Anyway, but there's no sign it's going to end. I didn't think it would last this long, because as a lot of people have said that it turned out to be rather worse. The Russian army's performance was much worse than was widely anticipated, and the Ukrainian resistance was much more ferocious and spirited than had been forecast by most people. So the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he was in Kiev visiting President Zelensky on Sunday. So was the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, as in most countries would call him Defense Secretary. Do you think Putin will still be in charge of Russia if he lost the war? I do actually, at least in the short term. It's difficult to see him being overthrown. And it seems like begging the question, but what does losing the war mean? Because he's going to come out of this with something, even if it's just a few kilometers to the Donbass, and try and sell that as a victory. People are talking about finding him an off-ramp. Now, I don't really want to save his face. I would love him to be humiliated. I would love him to be driven from office. I would like to see him and his coterie swinging from lampposts, but I don't think that's going to happen. And would that lead to an even worse Russia, even bloodier anarchy than it is? I think it might lay out some best case and worst case scenarios. I mean, the best case scenario is that Russia is swiftly defeated, Putin is overthrown, awarded reclusio perpetua, Russia transitions to being a free country, radically reduces its armaments, denuclearizes, and is never a menace to its neighbors ever again. And we can all live in peace. But I think that is utopian to believe that's going to happen. In the worst case scenario, right at the other end of the spectrum is a third world war. There's a nuclear exchange which leads to hundreds of millions of deaths, both in Russia and NATO countries. Now, the more probable outcome is somewhere between those two, is that Russia ends up grabbing something. There might be a de facto, not a de jure end to this conflict. It becomes a frozen conflict. Russia illegally occupies some of Luhansk and Donbass, a bit more than they've got already, stages these charades of referendums, and it's probable the majority of people in Luhansk and Donbass actually want to join Russia, but Putin's not going to be satisfied with 60% voting for that. It's got to be 90%. And you know that if you campaign a way he doesn't like, you're going to prison for a very long time indeed. So he will hold these bogus referenda, which would have no legal standing whatsoever, because they'd be held under the auspices and the superintendence of the illegal occupation forces, and there would be no free media or free expression there. Anyway, and then he would incorporate them into the Russian Federation, like he's done with Crimea, and he could try and say that's worth it. I mean, obviously it's a Pyrrhic victory. They've suffered at least 15,000 deaths, the Russian military, and it's really hammered their economy. They lost at least 10% of their economy. These sanctions are not going to be lifted anytime soon. There could be a United Nations peacekeeping force in there. Russia would have to vote for that. It's on the UN Security Council. They probably won't, to keep the two sides apart, but that is one option. And just for decades, Ukraine says this is our territory illegally occupied. We're into some situation like Jammu and Kashmir or Cyprus or something like that. Georgia was not as bad as war, and then Russia ends up permanently enfeebled and impoverished. Don't want to exaggerate. It's not going to get radically poorer. You know, it might get 20% poorer than it is by the end of the year, 20% poorer than it was before the end of the year, and for the next several years be shrinking a couple of percentage points. And the totality of that is Russia seriously weakened, but it would still have nuclear weapons. It would still have a formidable military. I know that they perform dismally, but they are quite large, and I'm thinking the numbers might begin to tell. I mean, I'm surprised this offence in Luhansk and Donbass hasn't really ramped up. It might not be there's going to be a big push, might be going to inflict the death of 1,000 cuts, going forward a kilometre here, a kilometre there. Now, a few days ago, the United States gave another 70 howitzers, these artillery pieces, to Ukraine. But why not give 7,000? I mean, the United States spends $700 billion a year on defense, 700 billion. And they've given about 3 billion to Ukrainian military aid so far in 2022. If they gave even 1% of their defense budget to Ukraine, that would be almost everything Ukraine would want. And they're not giving the latest jets, because partly because they take a very long time to train on this kit, partly the Americans are worried about these falling into the hands of the Russians. Inevitably, some are going to be shot down, and then the Russians could study them there at their leisure, and then that would mean there's not less of an element of surprise. The Russians could figure out how to take better countermeasures. But anyway, there's a lot of fight in the Ukrainian dog. There's little sign this war is going to end anytime soon, and countries are beginning to think Ukraine might be a winning proposition. They're ramping up military support. It reminds me of, let's say, Saratoga and the American Revolution. Up until that point, Spain, France, the Netherlands, those European countries are fairly hostile to the United Kingdom, thought, well, these farmers are rebelling in America, they'll be defeated in short order, so we're not gonna jeopardize relations with the United Kingdom by backing the revolutionaries in America, because that would be a fool's errand. But when they saw that the American Continental Army had inflicted a significant reverse on the British Army, the French in particular sat up and noticed and thought, hey, it is worth getting involved, it is worth backing them. And because the Ukrainians won the Battle of Kiev, the Asian countries are thinking, well, arming Ukraine is not simply prolonging the agony, it could even lead to a Ukrainian victory. Failing that, it could put them into a fairly strong position for negotiating a truce. Now, Finland not joining NATO, I won't say it's a game changer, but it'll be a headache for Russia, because there's a long border they don't need to defend, several hundred kilometers, about 600 kilometers with Finland, and now they need to think about doing it, because the Finnish army is tiny, but apparently it is superb. Because of that 1944 treaty, they're limited to very small armed forces. So they can't have numbers, but they can have excellence, state-of-the-art equipment. And so that will be on NATO's side. Will Sweden join? It's looking less likely. Republic of Ireland, there's no talk about it right now. That's anyway, even Finland joining is precisely what Russia doesn't want. Another NATO country in their border, and it's very close to St. Petersburg, which is Putin's home city. And it's a sign of desperation. There's a saber rattling, Sergei Lavrov reminding Western countries that they've got nuclear weapons and so on. But would Russia come out better out of this nuclear exchange? Okay, they kill hundreds of millions of people in NATO countries. They themselves would suffer tens of millions of deaths. How does that put Russia in a better position than it is now? It doesn't. I mean, Western countries would be worse off as well. But far better to not gain Luhansk and Donbass than have a nuclear exchange. So it's a scare tactic, but Putin, he's playing this madman thing like Nixon did with Vietnam. Has he got a breaking point? Are we pushing him to it? He's clearly a very unwell man, and the Russian media is increasingly clumsy in their lies, claiming he attended that Easter Sunday service in the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour in Moscow, when he was wearing exactly the same suit as he did at Easter Sunday last year. The man who's rarely seen wearing the same thing twice. So painting what they did is they simply recycled library pictures from the previous Easter Sunday service. So he's seen in public less frequently, and not for such lengthy appearances, seldom seen walking or standing, because he's ailing. He's a very unwell man, and that may affect his mind as well as his body. There may be a pharmacological fog in his body. So the Ukrainians, they obviously need more tanks. They're getting those T-72 tanks, Soviet-era tanks from Poland that they're already trained on. They didn't need training on the Ukrainians. And the United Kingdom is backfilling the Polish army and providing them with those British Challenger tanks. So the Poles give 100 T-72s, they get 100 Challengers, for instance, which are apparently much better, a generation on, more expensive. The United Kingdom obviously needs to manufacture more tanks to make up for the ones it's given away for free to the Poles and so on. So there should be more of that. There should be more aircraft, really more of everything to enable Ukraine to defend itself. And it's an awful pity, because obviously most Russians aren't bad people, including most Russian soldiers, despite the numerous atrocities that the Russian military has inflicted upon the Ukrainian civilian population. So this war's going to go on for another few months. As Bush Johnson said, it might even last to the end of the year. That's enough from me. Thanks for watching my channel. Toodaloo.